Another surprise when I started researching these idioms in the English language is how many of them actually came out of the translation of the Bible. Now, obviously, it is in English. We're talking about English idioms, and the translation we're talking about is likely the King James Version. But I believe that these idioms are very similar to the ones that we talked about in the intro episode, where in their originating language, they have very much the same meaning as they do in English. And starting out with one that is probably really well known to most people, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, of course, we know this to mean a person is pretending to be something they're not, and in fact, in doing so, is trying to maybe get access to a group or to a place where they just don't belong. Oftentimes, it can mean that a person seems friendly or harmless, but they aren't, and we should be wary around them. Well, this actually comes from the 1615 translation of the King James Bible, where in Matthew 7:15 it says, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravening wolves." Wolves in sheep's clothing. How about the phrase, "the writing is on the wall"? Obviously, this is something that's used a lot. In sports, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about this. Well, this is actually a biblical phrase as well. It can be traced back to the book of Daniel, where God actually prophesizes that King Belshazzar, who is on kind of a wild binge, awaiting punishment, even though he may not know it. But God sends an actual hand, and they write upon the wall the words, "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin." And that was a warning to tell Belshazzar that he was about to meet his downfall. Again, this comes from the book of Daniel, and because Belshazzar was not able to translate it, he actually calls for Daniel to come in and translate for him, and this is how the story starts to involve our hero of that book. But upon translating it, Daniel tells him that the warning is so clear, and only because Belshazzar is so worried about his sinful behavior, he didn't see the warning for what it was. The writing's on the wall. You just aren't able to see what it is. Here's one that I know I've used as a manager, and that's separating the wheat from the chaff. Now, this is an agrarian or a farm-based one, but it also has its sourcing in the Bible. Now, if you don't know, chaff is the casing that surrounds any of the grain. So think of wheat, for example. It's inedible by humans, so although livestock can eat it, we have to separate it out to use the wheat kernel that's underneath. And in Matthew 3:12, John the Baptist says, "His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat in the barn and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire." Essentially saying that you're separating the good from the bad, what can be used from what can't be used. And in this case, he's talking about God doing that. But by using the phrase separating the wheat from the chaff, you're essentially saying, I am separating out people who are useful to me and people who are not, or a thing that is useful to me from something that is not. And we can use it in that context today. The next one is definitely one I know my parents have used, getting by on the skin of your teeth. And obviously, that doesn't make a lot of sense to you as a kid or really as an adult because your teeth don't have skin, at least if you brush your teeth every day. Well, in Job 19:20, Job says, "My bone clings to my skin and to my flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth." And he's basically making an allusion to the fact that God had punished him for a long time, and he barely survived it. He got by the slimmest of margins, using the example of skin on the teeth, which obviously we know we don't have, something that is imperceptible, essentially. And ironically, that's exactly how we use it today. We're not misappropriating it in a different way. We are using it to show something that is so insignificant or insubstantial that it's surprising that we actually make it through. And one final example from the actual biblical text, the idea of something being difficult or almost impossible as threading the needle or getting through the eye of a needle. This also comes from the Bible. It's used in Matthew 19:24, Mark 10:25, and Luke 18:25. Multiple places because it is a allegory that Jesus uses, saying that it's more likely for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. And obviously, a camel getting through the eye of a needle would be very difficult. And we actually still use it in that same form today. Something very difficult, threading the needle, and obviously you may not know this, but threading the needle is the act of putting in a piece of thread through the eye of a needle, or something going through the eye of a needle, both difficult. I did have one more for this that wasn't actually quotes from the Bible, but came into common usage because of people who wanted to follow the Bible's rules, let's say. You've probably heard the term gadzooks, zounds, egad, cripes. These are all exclamations that were used a lot in the kind of campy 1960s Batman show and came into pop culture around that time. Well, the funny thing is that these are exclamations that are called minced oaths. They are Bible-friendly or Christian-friendly alternatives to swearing. The idea was that if you shouted God gadzooks instead of something else, in this case it was God's hooks, which doesn't make a lot of sense to us now, but was a reference to the nails on the cross and would have been a swear at some point in some parts of the world. But by using gadzooks, you would not have taken the Lord's name in vain, and you could avoid breaking some of the commandments. Similarly, gosh, jeepers, which are God and Jesus, and gadzooks kind of goes into the same tone as them. Things that you might say to avoid saying a curse word, in this case, the curse word being the name of God or something religiously related, rather than, Frankenfurters, instead of, I wanted to return to another example that I used in our intro episode about idioms and talk about some idioms that are more about celebrations or are contextual in their usage. And first up is one that we discussed in that intro episode, break a leg. Now, I always wondered, and maybe you always wondered, why people in theater would wish them other people break a leg rather than good luck. Well, this actually comes out of the German tradition, and ancient German folklore always said that you didn't want to tempt the bad spirits or the good spirits by wishing someone good luck. They believe that if you wished someone good luck, it would actually tempt the evil spirits to give them bad luck instead. But the same and the opposite must be true, right? So if you wish someone bad luck, maybe good luck would come. So actors on the German stage, which then brought it out to the rest of Europe, had the habit of wishing each other terrible luck and hoping that that would mean good luck. And the German phrase was actually Hals und Beinbruch, which would mean a broken neck and a broken leg. And we shorten that in English to just say break a leg. Now, there's another idiom that is actually originating in celebrations and doesn't have the meaning that it has now, but kind of has the opposite meaning the way we use it now. And that's giving the cold shoulder. Now, we know giving the cold shoulder as, somebody who's just off-putting and maybe didn't warm up to us when we met them, or in any kind of occasion of having an interaction with someone. But giving the cold shoulder was actually a polite way for a host in medieval England or France or even Germany to let everyone know that a feast or a party was over. Now, you would have unbelievable round after round of meat and vegetables and fruits, but people would just continue eating for days upon days. And how would someone know that we were in the midst of not just a break between courses, but that the meal was over? Well, the host would save a cold shoulder shank or beef shoulder or the shoulder of any of the animals that have been served during that feast, and then have that served to the table or individually to each of the guests as an indication of this is our last course, and you would politely usually decline to eat it and instead get yourself up and get yourself ready to go. So it was a understood, not rude, polite way of ending a party, even though now we see it as someone acting very rude to us instead. You might even say that on that meaning of cold shoulder, we were close, but no cigar. And speaking of which, where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from a history of the American Carnival and Midway. So back then, the games weren't aimed at kids, they were aimed at adults. Carnivals and the Midway weren't meant for kids at all. It was meant as an outing for adults who didn't have a lot of other things they could do at the time. So one of the rewards for winning a game would be a cigar. And the Carnival barkers and the Midway barkers would let people know if they had gotten real close to winning, but they didn't quite win, that you're close, but no cigar for you. And as a way of trying to encourage them to continue playing to possibly win that cigar. So it comes from actual carnival games. And speaking of things that might go in your mouth, What about the saying, born with a silver spoon in your mouth? Now, we know that today just means, oh, someone was rich, they came from money, that maybe they even didn't really have to work at all in their life. And the historical meaning is actually something very similar. It was a traditional gift for godparents to give to a new baby, a silver spoon. Now, if that spoon was actually silver, it was a sign that not only the parents, but everyone supporting that child as they grew had actual wealth. Oftentimes, they would be nickel plated with silver, or a much cheaper metal plated with silver, or even a metal that looked like silver but wasn't silver that was given to the child. And of course, those were from families of lesser means. But if someone got a pure silver spoon at their christening from their godparents, it meant everyone around them was rich. So clearly, those children were well off. They were from families where they wouldn't have to worry about money. And the meaning we take from it today is directly related to that. And one thing those people wouldn't have to do is eat humble pie with that silver spoon. Of course, we know today that eating humble pie has nothing to do with actually eating. It's about giving an apology, probably an embarrassing one. Maybe you've bragged a lot and now you have to backtrack that a bit. But the origins of that phrase are actually from eating a real pie. And this actually comes out of the history of the Middle Ages and hunting. So when a big group got together and went out for a hunt, after the hunt, there was always a feast where they would eat some of the animals that were slain during the hunt. Well, the master of the house, the one who organized the hunt, would always get the finest piece of meat after they were done hunting and enjoying their feast. And all of his best friends, well, all of the best noblemen, would all get really good pieces of meat. And they would work their way down the social ladder from there. And in fact, the least notable people there would get a pie, a minced meat pie that was made out of innards and leftovers from everything else. So no matter where you thought you were on the social spectrum, you would get a harsh awakening when, instead of a nice fillet, a piece of the humble pie was brought out to you. And in that way, maybe we use it very similarly to how it originated. Finally, what about minding your P's and Q's? Now, this phrase is currently used generally by parents letting their kids know that they need to behave, mind your P's and Q's. But this actually originates from the bars of the Middle Ages. At that time, drinks were served in either pints or quarts, P's or Q's. And this phrasing comes out of one or another or both of situations that would arise in the bar. First, barmaids needed to keep track of who was drinking pints and who was drinking quarts, to be sure that as drinks started emptying, they were quick to bring about another drink for that patron. So the barmaids needed to mind their P's and their Q's, their pints and their quarts, to keep those straight. Also, if there was a ruckus that started in a bar, oftentimes the bartender would then shout out, mind your P's and Q's, or mind your pints and quarts, meaning pay attention to your own business, don't worry about what's going over there in the corner of the bar. So in both of these phrasings, the minding the pints and the quarts was about kind of paying attention to what you need to pay attention to, which is very different, especially given that it was a bar, from how parents are using that phrase today. So in the past few episodes, we've talked about some ancient idioms, we've talked about some English idioms, and we've talked about idioms that kind of began in different situations. But I wanted to break away to talk about some idioms that are 100% American. Now, most of these come from the early American experience, and we'll talk about some later American experience ones later, but these ones we're going to discuss today are from the early and early-ish, I suppose, years of the American experiment. And first up, we always talk about burying the hatchet as, we're going to get over whatever our dispute is and kind of move on and try to settle things out. Well, this actually comes from a very similar situation in its original usage. During negotiations between the early American settlers and the Native Americans, men would actually bury all of their weapons nearby to where the negotiation was happening as a symbol that we're coming here in peace and we intend to forge a peace treaty and not need these weapons in the future. Now, of course, they would dig them back up and take them with them afterward, but it was a sign that peace was their intent. Something that continues to be an issue of contention amongst my friends, a group of, adult men, is the issue of riding shotgun. And specifically for them, what are the rules about calling shotgun? But for us, why is it riding shotgun or calling shotgun anyway? Well, this actually comes from, again, the Wild West, which we've discussed in a previous episode. But during that time period, stagecoaches would often have 2 or 3 members of the staff. The first would be the driver, the one who was in control of the reins. The second would sit up front with the driver, and they would be sure to carry with them their rifle or their shotgun. This was meant to ward off anybody who might think about robbing the stagecoach. As a side note, a third staffer might be the person in the back of the stagecoach who would help the people get on and off and take care of the luggage. But the person up front would be riding shotgun on that stagecoach because they literally would take a rifle or a shotgun with them. And now the person who rides in the front seat of a car is riding shotgun. Now, as I said, my friends and I often argue about the rules for calling shotgun, and I feel like half the time I have to tell them to put a sock in it. And you may wonder, why does the term put a sock in it mean to shut up? Well, this again is an early American idiom. In the late 19th century, all that we had in order to make music, or for entertainment at home really, was gramophones. And gramophones were wound up using a handle on the side, and they would turn the turntable and allow a record to spin under a needle. The sound would then be played through a large horn, and it would fill the room with whatever was on the record. But they don't have, and I didn't mention there, a volume knob. There was no way to control the volume at all. The only way to make it sound quieter was to actually stick socks into the base of the gramophone, and that would deaden the sound a little bit and lower the volume. So to put a sock in it is to lower the volume, and we still use it in that way today. Now, how about a phrase that I heard a lot in the last week or so, which was, "It costs an arm and a leg." And I've always wondered, why is it that something would be so expensive that it would cost you an arm and a leg? Well, it's actually not about losing an arm and a leg, but it's about the depiction of an arm and a leg. In the 18th century, there were no cameras. There was no way to take a photograph. So oftentimes people who had wealth would have a painting done of them, a portrait. And the rule of thumb was, to use another idiom, that the more was shown in the portrait, the more expensive it was. So if you had a bust, just your shoulder and head, there was a base cost. But if you were to add an arm, and God forbid a leg, then the cost was going to go up exponentially. So to have something cost far more, or to be way more expensive than the base product, was to cost the cost of an arm and a leg. And speaking of cost, what about the phrase selling someone down the river? Well, this one has a very dark history. We use it now as a phrase meaning that we betrayed someone, or that we, especially when we betrayed them to benefit ourselves, but we chose ourselves over someone else. Well, in the early 1800s, America had outlawed the importation of slaves from Africa. But the internal slave market was still alive and well. And at this time, some of the plantations that had originated when the country began, or even before, found that their soil was not as good for growing crops anymore. So what they began to do was to put slaves on boats and move them towards the interior of the country, further west, towards Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Louisiana. And oftentimes, especially in the North, where slavery was falling out of favor, to use yet another idiom, they would put the slaves on boats that would eventually use the Mississippi River and take them down to New Orleans, where the largest slave market was. So they were literally selling them down the river. And we actually take some of that dark meaning of the slave trade into how we use it today, that it's a bad thing to sell someone down the river. Finally, an American idiom that you would never think was American: kangaroo courts. Now, of course, kangaroos are native to Australia and have never been on the North American continent. So how is it an American idiom to call something a kangaroo court? Well, in the mid-19th century, the gold rush was happening in California, Oregon, Washington, and later on in Alaska. And people not only came from the East Coast, but from all over the world to hunt their fortunes in California. And it's likely that some Australians were amongst them, or that someone who was well-traveled returned back to America to hunt their fortune there. And as it was a little bit of a wild area, courts and trials were a little hit and miss at the time. Often, we would go kind of straight to the sentencing phase and skip the whole trial aspect of it. Now, as you probably know, kangaroos do a lot of hopping and skipping. That's their mode of transportation. So people who were there in the West at the time likened the American justice system to a kangaroo, hopping and skipping straight to the sentencing phase and often to the death penalty. And while we might not use that to describe the American justice system as a whole everywhere, it certainly is still used to describe any judicial process that seems to move too quickly or skip over important steps. So we're going to take a step away from the episodes about idioms for just a couple of episodes because I had someone ask me an interesting question, and during this time of the year, in this year especially, I thought it was important to get some episodes out so that the questions could get answered. So a special thank you to Roxanne and to Roberto and to Katya, all friends of the show, for bringing some of these topics to my attention so that we could do an episode on them and address them. But we are going to be talking about the U.S. government, not about the people who hold the offices. This isn't a political discussion. This is a discussion about politics. And I figured the way to start is to start kind of at the beginning with the Constitution. Most specifically, the question that was asked is, why does Congress get to say whether or not a justice is on the Supreme Court, and why do they serve for a lifetime when everyone else has to run for office? Well, that comes back to one of the central tenets of the Constitution. And we're going to go through that, as well as the powers of all of those offices, and even about the elections and some things about the Electoral College, which is a popular question at this time, over the next few episodes. But we're going to start with what's at the heart of the matter, and that is the separation of powers. Now, that may be a new term to all of you. During my undergrad studies at Hofstra University, where I got my bachelor's degree in political science, it was probably the first term used in an intro class, which everyone there should have already been made aware of. But for those of you who haven't studied politics as thoroughly as I have, the separation of powers is a distinct construct. It is the reason we really have a constitution. As I explained it to those guys who asked me about the topic, at the time when the Constitution was being founded, there were essentially three types of government. There were a absolute monarchy, or an absolute despotism, where a single leader basically made all the decisions for the country. There were constitutional monarchies, like what the United Kingdom was moving towards at the time, where there was a governing body, like a parliament, and there was a king or a ruler of some kind, and in some ways they shared powers back and forth. And on the very small scale, there were democracies, where in a city-state, for instance, there could be a group of voters who would have been the only real citizens, and they cast votes for basically every decision, or maybe casting votes regularly to decide who would lead them. And what the founders of the United States were looking to do is to take that concept from the very small city-states and apply it to a very large country, something that had not really been done before. Now, the term separation of powers was actually coined by Charles-Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. And I said in an episode of my other podcast, the Everyman Movie Review, that, oh, those British people with their long names. But boy, do the French love their long names as well. He was an 18th century French social and political philosopher, and he coined a term, as I said, the separation of powers, or in French, trias politica. And please excuse my horrible French pronunciation. But in his publication, Spirit of the Laws, he essentially set about the framework that the founders of the United States would look to when designing their democratic government for their new country. Now, once we get through the actual setup of the Constitution and the government as it is displayed now, I do want to go back and do an episode about the Articles of Confederation, because everything that we're going to talk about here is essentially from 1789 and onward. Now, we celebrate July 4th every single year as the birthday of the United States, and that's when the Declaration of Independence was signed. However, there was a lot of time between 1776 and 1789, and during that period, the government was trying to figure itself out, including during the time of the Constitutional Convention, where these principles were decided. But that's for a later episode. For now, we're going to talk about the Constitution and the separation of powers. Now, the Baron de Montesquieu essentially came up with a political model where he asserted that the political authority of the state, rather than resting in the hands of one person or a powerful few, would instead be spread out amongst three branches of government: a legislative, an executive, and a judicial. And that to most effectively promote liberty, which was his eventual goal, and of course the goal of the founders, that the powers that were given to each of those branches would not overlap. They would each have their own role and their own powers, and they would act as a check and balance on the powers of the other, allowing no one to become too powerful and establish a despotic situation. So to kind of summarize all that, the separation of powers is the division of government power and responsibility into distinct branches to limit any one from becoming too powerful. And from its beginning, it has been executive, legislative, and judicial, and we follow that model here in the United States today. The legislative branch makes the laws, and the legislative branch in the United States is the Congress. It's made up of two separate bodies within it, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The executive branch is made up of the president, the vice president, and the cabinet level secretaries who head up all of the administrations that make up our government. Essentially, if you have any contact with the government, it's likely that you have that contact through one of these administrations. While the legislative branch makes the laws, it is the job of the executive branch for implementing and administering the public policies that are enraptured by the laws passed by the legislative branch. And it is able to do so because it is funded through the legislative branch. The final branch is the judicial branch. This is represented in our government by the Supreme Court of the United States and the lower federal courts, the U.S. Court of Appeals and the U.S. District Courts. And the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting the Constitution and the laws as it pertains to the Constitution, and they apply their interpretation of those laws and the Constitution itself to controversies that are brought before any of those judicial bodies. Now, this separation of powers was actually embraced not only at the federal level, but mostly on the state level as well. Of the 50, 40 states have laws that enact the separation of powers into branches in their state constitutions. And for all 40, the separation is into three distinct bodies. An example I saw frequently was California's state constitution. Of course, I am a citizen of California currently. And the California Constitution says the powers of state government are legislative, executive, and judicial. Persons charged with the exercise of one power may not exercise either of the others except as permitted by this Constitution. So there enacted in form is the separation of powers. Now, as we're going to get into in a future episode, while separation of powers is ideal and it is key to the workings of government and keeping things moving, no democratic society really exists with an absolute separation of powers. There is always an overlap. And in fact, even when we're talking about more despotic regimes, there's no absolute lack of separation of powers. Even when in a constitutional monarchy, there is a king who seems to have all the true power, there is always other branches to facilitate it, whether it's a judicial branch made up of courts or a governing body like a legislature that may just be a rubber stamp on what the president or the king or the czar wants. A lot of the responsibilities and the powers of government overlap. And they're very complex, especially in a society like the United States. And they're interrelated. And that has caused, over the course of the history of the United States and other Western democracies, conflict in between and among the branches of government. Also, as history passes, we see that there is a ebb and flow of the power, where it may reside in one of the bodies more than the others, and then move to a different body more than the others. And sometimes that is purposeful, and sometimes it's accidental, and we'll get into that in future episode as well. But the important thing to note is that the separation of powers is key to our government's function, and the Constitution itself is divided up into sections that outline that separation of power. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the Constitution, the executive branch in Article 2, the judicial branch in Article 3. So although it's not explicit that there is a separation of powers, and in fact James Madison, who is one of the authors of the Bill of Rights, wanted to put in an amendment to the Constitution which added an explicit line about the separation of powers. But everyone who discussed it said, isn't it implicit in the document itself? We've separated out the articles, and we've described the job, the roles, the powers of all of these bodies. It's implicit in the document that there is a separation of powers, and therefore an amendment's not necessary. And we've moved forward from that point with the understanding that there is a separation of powers between the three branches of government in the United States as outlined in the Constitution. And for our next episodes, we're going to go through those branches and talk about their individual powers and where they may or may not have overlapped with the powers of others and how they act as a check and balance on the other branches as well. So finally today, let's turn to the third branch of government, the judicial branch. We've talked a little bit about this when we talked about the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court building in earlier episodes, but they, of course, are a separate and distinct branch of government with their own powers, their own checks and balances on the other branches, and those branches hold a check and power over them. While the other branches have to worry about re-election, Congress, or the House of Representatives, every 2 years, the Senate every 6, and the President every 4. Any member nominated to a federal bench does not have to worry about that because they have a lifetime appointment. Now, there is a federal retirement age that is sometimes honored, and generally judges don't get to that age. But it's never, as far as I can tell, been enforced against anyone that they must retire by a certain age, and especially not on the Supreme Court. But essentially, once they are on a bench, they are there until they don't want to be anymore, either by their choice or by their death. Now, we did skip over this a little bit in the last episode, but the judicial branch can be impeached by the Congress, meaning that charges can be brought and passed by the House of Representatives and a trial held in the Senate, but that's only happened one time for the judicial branch and only 3 full times, with maybe a 4th, for the executive branch in Congress, and no one has ever been removed by impeachment and conviction. However, it is a power that a lifetime appointment doesn't necessarily mean lifetime. If you abuse that power too much, Congress has the right to remove you. But the judicial branch has the power of evaluating laws. They interpret how the law should be applied and whether or not the administrative branch, the executive branch of government, has been interpreting and applying them correctly. The court can overturn either the law itself based on an act of Congress that conflicts with the Constitution, or an act of the lower courts or the lower legislatures, the state legislatures, or it can change the way that the executive is forced to enact that legislation because it finds that the enactment of it is unconstitutional. Now, when we think of the judicial branch, we generally think of the Supreme Court, but there is, of course, the entire federal appeals courts and the federal district courts. Every court at the federal level is set up just like your state. There are several levels where you hold an original trial, then the appeals go through several levels of appeal till it gets to the Supreme Court, which is your last chance at any court anywhere in the United States. Not every case can go to federal court. You can appeal generally any holding of the highest court of any state to the federal court. However, unless you have already exhausted everything within your state, the only thing that can be taken to federal court are questions of federal law. Is this thing in controversy a federal law? Is it a dispute between states? Is it a dispute between parties in different states that would have conflicting law applied to it? If so, then federal court may be the place to go. But otherwise, the federal courts will deny you relief because if it's you and your neighbor, that case has to be tried at the district court level at your state and work its way up through the state processes first. And I waited until this episode to talk a little bit about the checks and balances of power because the judicial branch is the most interesting one when it comes to this. While the separation of powers is outlined in the Constitution, Congress has a very large article describing it. The executive has a basically the same size, slightly smaller article describing it, but Article 3 that describes the judicial branch is relatively small. And it could have been an unequal partner in this balancing act between the separation of powers of government. However, one of the early justices of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, established in a very early case, Marbury versus Madison, that the idea of judicial review was not just about deciding cases based on the litigants in the case, but it was about looking at the underlying law and the underlying decisions of the administrative branch and saying whether or not they acted appropriately. And because he did this on several occasions while he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he was able to establish the judiciary as a separate and equal part of the government and create a powerful branch where one had not really been created by the Constitution. It's also likely that without John Marshall or someone like him who had established the judiciary as an equal partner, it would have always been a small and minority part of the government, and that power would have just been balanced between the legislative and the executive. Now, I said in an earlier episode that there is an ebb and flow between Congress and the executive. However, we are seeing in recent years that the power is really turning towards the judicial branch. The control over the majority on the Supreme Court may be make or break when it comes to passing and enacting legislation. Because no matter what you do, if the court's going to strike it down, then there's no reason to move forward. But if you can control, if your party, if your belief system can control the judicial branch, then you can undo a lot of changes that were made by previous generations, and you may be able to protect the changes you want to make today. Because whether or not you have control of all of the branches at the same time, the judiciary, with its lifetime appointments, can be just a key in making sure that everything you want to stay the way you want it to stay does. It's also probably worth noting that the judicial branch has a check and balance on it that is only at the time when it is kind of enacted. Meaning, when a justice is nominated to the Supreme Court or a judge to the lower courts, Congress has oversight over the president's nomination. But that person then has a lifetime appointment, so they are free from worries about re-election or really any check on their power at all. This allows, in theory, them to be separate from all of the political gamesmanship that may be found in the executive and legislative branch. However, as I said, it is not necessarily free from that at all. It is up to the justices to whether or not they're going to follow their core beliefs at the time when they're nominated. And there have been many justices who over time have become more liberal or more conservative, and while they were nominated by one president who was expecting something out of them, they got a much different person on the court. Many people say that the current Chief Justice, John Roberts, who was nominated by President George W. Bush, is not exactly the judge that they thought they were getting, that he has ruled in ways that were surprising. And that may be because they nominated a very young man compared to other justices to the Supreme Court. And as he gets older, it's likely that his views and opinions will change. But unfortunately for either side, he is there until he decides he's done, or until life decides it is done with him. So in that way, the judicial branch, thanks to John Marshall, may wield the most power out of all of the other branches. But keep in mind, as I mentioned during the Supreme Court episodes, Congress has the ability to add or subtract justices at any time. So it really is a final nuclear option, if you will, on the judicial power by either adding justices or taking them away to ensure that there is some limitation on what the judicial branch will do. Next, we are going to turn to the legislative branch of government, which in the United States is made up of the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. But let's dive into those a little more specifically. The House of Representatives is a body made up of 435 members, and these members all represent a single district within a state inside the United States. Each of these districts is proportionally about the same number of people, although every state needs to have at least one representative. And I do want to do a future episode about the U.S. Census and why it's so important, but one of the reasons it is so important is because every 10 years, these 435 seats are redistributed out to the states. If a state gains a lot of population, they may gain another seat in Congress. If they lose population, they may lose a seat in Congress. And that can certainly be a shakeup in an election where two districts have become one district, and that means that two people had a job, but only one person's going to have a job in the future. Based on the 2000 census, the average population of a district was 646,946 people. That means that although there is obviously some variation, a state, when it's dividing up its congressional districts, has to find about 647,000 people to group together in a district. Now, based on early numbers from the 2010 census, it appears as though the average population is going to go up to 710,767 people. That means that the average district inside a state, once it's divided up into separate districts, will need to have about 711,000 people in it. But this does vary across the different states. For instance, Montana is the state with the most people in the average district at 994,000 people, both now and in 2000, where it had 905,000 people in it. The state with the fewest people in the average district was Rhode Island at 527,000 people, and Wyoming with 495,000 people. And, of course, there are some states that only have one district. Alaska, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming all have populations small enough that once all of the seats are divvied out, they only get one seat, and that seat is elected at large, just like the United States Senate seat. Every other state is divided up, and a congressman runs in their district. So using Montana in the earlier example of the most people, that's because that's everyone in the state. And the same with Wyoming. And in fact, Alaska, Delaware, and Wyoming have never had more than one district. They've never had populations which justified putting in more than one congressional district in the entire state. So keeping in mind that Delaware was the first state, meaning the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution, from its very origins, it has only had one representative and two senators since the beginning. But let's talk about the United States Senate now, because things have changed a lot by the United States Senate. The House has always been elected by district, even if that district was the entire state, and by popular vote. However, the Senate has not always operated that way. Under the Constitution, the Senate was originally appointed by the state legislature. So the state legislature, when the time came, would actually appoint either a new or redo the appointment of the current senator from their state. And this was considered an indirect form of voting, because although people weren't voting directly for their senators, they were electing the state legislators, and those legislators were electing the Senate. It was believed that by having the direct popular vote in the House of Representatives, that was the people's House of Congress. And by having the Senate be controlled by the state legislatures, that there was a level of separation from the people, which would protect the people from themselves. It's also kind of the reason we have the Electoral College, but again, we'll get to that in a future episode. But all that changed in 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution. That moved the Senate from indirect voting via the state legislators to direct voting, meaning that you will vote for not only your district congressman, but also you have a likelihood of voting for a senator at some time. 1/3 of the Senate is replaced every 2 years. So there are 100 members of the Senate, 2 for each state, and 33 are up for election at any 2-year period. The term is 6 years, so they essentially have a 6-year term from when they're elected, but no two senators from a state will likely have the same election year. And of course, 2 years is fine to do elections because Congress, the House of Representatives, is only elected every 2 years. So they have to have elections every 2 years, while the Senate gets an extra 4 years on top of that to have their term. Now, the original Constitution treated the Senate much like it was an en loco parentis kind of situation, that the American people, the average voter, wasn't too bright, and that they had to be protected from themselves in ways. So they elected the Senate indirectly to make sure that they would be able to continue to do that. The Senate was also granted much more power in ways than the House was. The House has limitations on all the times for argument, while the Senate has the power of the filibuster, meaning someone could just talk and talk and talk, and once they have the floor forever until they give it up. But while the power of the smaller states was much smaller in the House, it was equal in the Senate. So no matter whether you were from the smallest state or from the largest state, each of them only got 2. There was an equality in having the equal number on the more powerful body. And obviously, after the 17th Amendment, it also meant that the people were the ones who were nominating, voting for, and sending to Washington, D.C. their senators who held that power. Now, in the last episode, we talked a little bit about the encroachments of and the limitations of executive power. Well, the same has happened in Congress. In fact, we got into it a little bit in the last episode. If Congress disagrees with something that the administration is doing, they always have the right to pass more legislation, in fact, more specific legislation on that topic. By having more specific legislation, it limits what the executive can do when putting that into action. In fact, back in 1986, the Supreme Court decided in Bowsher v. Sinar that the executive could not allow the Comptroller General of the United States, who is essentially the accountant for the entire country in the executive branch, to take money and then put out that money without it first going to Congress to have them legislate where the money would go. They found that it was an overstep of the constitutional powers for the executive to take money based on a law Congress has provided, but then give that money out without having it first returned to the general coffers. And as we also talked about a little in the previous episode, the Congress, especially the Senate, has the right to confirm the justices of the Supreme Court, but not only them. All of the presidential appointees are subject to confirmation by the Senate. And at times, the president has tried to get around these protections by setting up new administrations that aren't cabinet level, and then essentially saying this person doesn't need to be confirmed by the Senate because they're not cabinet level official. But in 2020, just this year, Celia Law versus CFPB, which is the Consumer Finance Protection Board, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution's separation of power was violated because this independent agency within the executive department had vast and substantial executive power across many separate individual departments within the executive whose officials were confirmed by Congress, but that the leader of that board was not confirmed by Congress. And if he could be removed by the president only for cause, that left Congress out of the circle of checks and balances for this very powerful board. And much like the executive, Congress also has its own immunities. That there is an immunity built into the protections of the Constitution itself, which said that anything said on the floor of the House or during House or Senate business, that there was an immunity for the members of Congress to what they said. Essentially, you can make any argument you want, whether it's in a bill or in argument on the floor or in a committee meeting, and no one can come to you and sue you for what you've said afterward. And there was actually a case in 1979, Hutchinson v. Proxmire, which said that protection doesn't extend to other things. For instance, if you want to use an argument that might have been slanderous against someone in your materials for re-election, you've now lost the protection of congressional immunity. When you said it on the floor of Congress, you had immunity. But when you use it outside of that context, there is no immunity. But probably the strongest power that Congress has is always the power of the purse strings. In fact, it is Congress who generally gets the blame when there is a government shutdown, which has seemed to happen more often in the last few years. And even now, with discussions about a bailout, about coronavirus, all of these discussions come down to why isn't Congress acting? Because the executive cannot pay any money out without it being approved by Congress first. Not that he always will. The president has a veto power over Congress, which can only be overcome by a 2/3 majority of both houses, but the original bill must come from Congress. Any payment of any money, any appropriations of any kind have to start there. So the power of the purse string is their strongest weapon. For today, I wanted to take one last episode when we're talking about the branches of government and try to dispel people of what I think is an overly popularized notion, and that is that the United States is a democracy. That's right. The United States is not, in fact, a democracy. Now, you are probably blown away by that. You've been hearing since you were a small child about the United States being a democracy. But the truth is, if we look at our foundational documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence even, and all of the supporting documentation around it, you will find that a democracy we are not. But you see, in a democracy, as I mentioned in the first episode of this series, is a system where everyone who is eligible to vote essentially votes about every decision that's made. But in a country with 350 million citizens, it just isn't possible to poll every single person about every single decision. The Senate in ancient Greece was actually just really made up of all of the men who qualified to vote. If you qualified to vote, you could show up in the Senate and offer your opinion and offer your vote on matters of the day-to-day business. But when a group gets bigger than a city-state, that really becomes impossible. What you do in that case is then look towards more of a representative system where instead of everyone voting for every single decision, you vote for people who will represent you, and they will go and make that decision on the day-to-day basis for you. And logically, you would choose someone who thinks like you do. This is how we developed political parties, because you can kind of outline your platform, and if people agree with it, they vote for you, and they assume that during your time in office, you will continue to vote the way that you've always voted and that you've promised them you will vote. Now, nothing actually holds you to that. Obviously, you can vote any way that you want to. But for the House of Representatives, you have an election every 2 years, which is a check and balance by the people on the people, which is a check and balance by the voters on the people they send to represent them. In the Senate, it's only every 6 years. So perhaps that power is a little more free than it might have been otherwise. But keep in mind, the original Constitution had indirect voting for the Senate. So it was, I suppose, thought that senators were more trustworthy because they would have to answer to the state legislatures, not just to the voters. But once you start electing people on your behalf, you now have a representative democracy. But once the population starts to grow even larger, now you need an entire administration complex to actually enact the things that the group has decided on. And when you elect people to represent you, and then you have a group of non-elected people who are carrying out the bidding of the elected group, you now don't have a democracy anymore. You have a republic. And that is what the United States is. It is a republic. Now, you've probably heard those words used relatively interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. What essentially the United States is a federal republic with a democratic election process. What that means is we have representatives who run the day-to-day for us. We have representatives who make decisions on the day-to-day for us. We vote through generally a plurality, meaning the one with the most votes is the one chosen to go represent us. And after those day-to-day decisions are made, they are carried out through an entirely structured administration process to get back to us. So we vote for people. Those people enact laws. The laws are carried out by someone else and an entire administration who then brings the benefit back to us. That is a democratically elected republic. The United States, as I said, has taken this one step further. We are a federal republic with a democratic election process. So we are a two-leveled system where each of the states in many ways operates as its own nation. It has its own independent processes set up. And where the legislature for the federal government has decided not to enact any law, the state can step in and enact law. Where the federal government has enacted some laws, the state can step in and actually enact more stringent laws. What they can't do is enact a law that it conflicts with what the federal government has said. So the federal government is the first authority. The state government can come in and make more protections, but they cannot make less. They can make more stringent action, but they cannot make less stringent action. And this is a federal republic. Since we vote for all of these representatives, especially now after the 17th Amendment, in a democratic process, we have a democratically elected federal republic. Now, if sometime in the future, a absolutely secure system were able to be enacted where every single citizen who wanted to vote could vote on the day-to-day business of the entire country, we could actually return back to that truly democratic model. Everyone goes to their screen, they sit and watch whatever argument they want, made by whoever they want to make it. I suppose all 350 million people would have the option of making an argument, which sounds like an exhaustive process. And then all of the people who want to vote could cast a vote, and plurality would rule on that decision. However, as you can imagine, that process would take a long time, and governance would be nearly impossible, even if we were to build an infrastructure, an administrative infrastructure, who would carry it out. And that's the other benefit of a federalized republic, or a republic really specifically, is that it allows government to function without needing to inform and get the opinions of everyone, and allowing the opinion of everyone to be expressed. We have essentially ceded our vote on the day-to-day to someone else who acts on our behalf. And this is the best way for large groups of people to actually get anything done. You can actually see this in some of the small scale in some movements, popular movements that have popped up. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Occupy movement from 2011. Well, this started out as a purely and truly democratic movement. Everything was taken to the entire general population of the movement. Votes were held. Anyone who was present could pass a vote, yay or nay, and the whole group would honor that decision. Oftentimes, this was taken by a voice vote, but if there was any controversy, they would actually sit down and take a hand count vote of all the members who were present. But as the movement grew, and as even some of the cities grew to where they could not have everyone offering their opinion on every issue, what you saw was the development of somewhat Republican values inside of the movement. Meaning, I, as a member of Occupy, might cede my vote or grant my vote to one person, and another 50 people would do the same. That one person would then go to a smaller group of, say, 20 or 25 people who had all received the proxy vote of larger groups. They could then discuss, they can argue, and my assumption is that the person I grant my proxy to is going to act as if he or she were me at that moment. That smaller group makes it much more easier to discuss and argue and debate. Then they vote, and a decision is made, and that vote is taken back to the general population. That is essentially what the founders set out to do here in the United States. So, if someone mentions to you that the United States is democracy in the future, make sure that you correct them. We vote using democratic processes, and then that way we are a democracy, but our government is a federal republic, or just a republic.